looking at noise versus feedback as part of our People Paradox series. And when I think of the word feedback, it's gotten popularized today. It seems like every executive I talk to wants to know, how can we get better feedback? How can we create a culture of feedback? But the first thing that comes to my mind when it comes to feedback are those moments when I might be out to dinner somewhere and that's slowly starting to come back, or I'm with family and you go into the restroom and you look in the mirror and you smile and you see this just big thing of broccoli or spinach just hanging out in your teeth. And you go, well, I'm glad there's a mirror. And how come nobody else around me cared enough to actually tell me what I looked like and what was there? Did they just not notice? Surely they noticed. Did they not want to tell me? How come? And so it's kind of humorous when that happens. But when we ratchet that up on a grander scale, as I was preparing for this conversation, thinking of how many leaders I've worked with where a lack of feedback on their performance and self-awareness actually was the cause of their derailment and maybe even losing a position. And so feedback, it's nice to know when we've got spinach in our teeth, but when that has larger, more scaled up implications, how do we know what that feedback is? How do we get the right feedback and have people tell us how we are actually showing up? Today, it's even more challenging, I think, for leaders because there are so many competing messages for our attention. We think of all the ads, the news, the alerts on our phones, text messages, calls, Slack, IM, people reaching out to you. There's so many things that compete for our attention today, and so many people are paying money to get our attention. How do we know? How do you and I know what to pay attention to? When it comes to feedback, what is a signal that should catch our attention? And what's just noise that we need to let go of? And how do we get the feedback we need, but also discern what to pay attention to and what to ignore? And part of the paradox, I think, when it comes to feedback with leaders is that we live in a day and age when we have more information than ever, and yet a more difficult time discerning truth than maybe ever before. Information, knowledge doesn't always equate wisdom, and our lives are short, our decisions matter. As one author I know often says, to choose well is to live well. And so how we choose with a myriad of information coming at us about us and what we should believe or think is important for leaders. And it's also interesting because something I've observed, I don't have empirical data on this. I've got a lot of research I'm going to share today, but I don't have empirical data on this. But an observation I've had is that the more senior a leader is, the more responsibility they have in the organization. Ironically, the less likely they are to be receiving actual actionable feedback. They certainly get a lot of noise. They'll say I get a lot of complaints, but how do I sift through what's a complaint, what's just noise, to what should I actually pay attention to? So the irony is that more responsibility is often inversely related to the quality of our feedback. And we all need feedback. We certainly need positive feedback. That's a whole nother talk on how we need probably more positive feedback. And we learn from positive feedback in different ways than corrective feedback. But when it comes to corrective feedback, what we should course correct and adjust, the more responsibility we have, the more noise we have, but often the less feedback we have and know to act on. To compound it even further, what the research would suggest is that while we all need feedback, it helps us be able to calibrate our performance and actually increase performance. It uncovers blind spots. It can help us grow our self-awareness. One of the challenges is that not all feedback is good. The research would suggest, across a lot of studies, that about a third of the time, feedback decreases performance. Feedback hurts more than it helps. And so we get a lot of noise. Not all of it is worth paying attention to. And when we do get feedback, the way it's delivered, people it's delivered from, the feedback we receive can actually decrease our performance. It's one of the reasons when people say to us, oh, I think I just should just do a 360 process in my organization. I often want to pump the brakes and say it could be helpful, but just getting feedback for the sake of feedback might actually have unintended negative consequences. So, one of the reasons when somebody says we just do a lot of surveys, I'm always questioning what are you doing with that feedback? Because you can gather a lot of data and it might actually set you up for an unintended consequence of what people expect you to do that you might not be ready to get into. So, how do we receive feedback and discern it from the noise to increase our performance, build our confidence and efficacy instead of eroding it? And how do we know what to pay attention to? How can we take in feedback, get better quality feedback, and then be able to filter that feedback? So I'm going to focus on two things today. How do we increase the quality of the feedback we receive? And I'm going to give you 4 strategies. And then I'm going to give some ideas on how can we filter the feedback we receive to decide if we should take action on it. How do we increase the quality of the feedback? And how do we filter that feedback for ourselves? And I'm focusing on ourselves as leaders because there's a whole workshop on how you can deliver effective feedback. And often we want to go to that right away. How do I give feedback to somebody else? But as leaders, it often starts with us. How can I request and receive and filter feedback well, and then start to model what that looks like for others, even before I think about how do I just go right to giving corrective feedback to other people. So here's 4 strategies for how to increase the quality of our feedback, and then I'll get into a filter. The first thing is to ask for feedback often. Ask for corrective feedback often and immediately. And by the way, I believe all feedback is constructive. Some constructive feedback is positive, some constructive feedback is corrective. Corrective feedback, how do we course correct? It's kind of like a jug of milk, has been my experience. And this is what the research would suggest. There's an expiration date by which it begins to spoil. The longer the distance between an event, a moment, and the feedback you receive, the less salient it is, the less meaningful it is, the fuzzier it's going to be, and the less likely we're going to connect the dots between our intent, our actions, and our impact. So you can imagine at the end of this session, if I ask the WiLD team, if I ask them for feedback on how I'm delivering this content, if I ask them immediately after, they're probably going to have some really meaningful things to say. And it's recent, so I can connect the dots. If I ask them in 2 weeks, it's going to be harder for them to remember. It's going to be more of a gut feeling, kind of a fuzzy, I think it was good. And I'm not going to get something that's going to be particularly helpful. So asking for feedback and doing it often. And this is one of the reasons it's important to ask him. Asking immediately gives us more details, but asking regularly gives people the permission to come to us unsolicited. I had a particular leader I was working with, and he was going through a rocky period. He was new in his role, wasn't quite fitting in with his new team, and he asked everybody on the team, he sent an email out and said, I would love to get I believe that feedback is a gift, and I'd love yours. Now, a number of people reached out and said, I'd love to set up some time and give you some feedback on how you're showing up in this new culture. And he never followed through on those meetings. And so the unintentional consequence was he asked for something that he actually didn't want. It was lip service. And so no one was actually going to bring him that feedback. Conversely, I've seen leaders who on a regular basis are going to ask questions like, help me understand how my actions are impacting you and your work. Now, they're not doing it to pander or to try to position themselves. They're genuinely trying to understand, and they're doing it with enough regularity that those who are leading under them know that they can come to them and they have permission. They have the unspoken permission to speak and bring it to them, and they know there's an open flow. So, first thing is ask for it and ask for it often. Second, ask for specifics. Intentionality with specificity can help us drive behavioral change. But oftentimes, if we do ask for feedback, I'm guilty of this, we give lazy requests. And a lazy request for feedback will give, if we get the feedback, a lazy response for feedback. So if I went to any one of you and said, hey, I just think you're not a good leader, I just think you're not very good at leading. One, you're going, all right, well, that's kind of harsh and overstated and generalized. So after you got over the maybe personal part, you'd say, all right, well, could you actually give me something specific? Is it how I communicate? Is it my presence and how I show up? Is it the vision I'm setting? Is it how I'm handling conflict? The way I'm forming the team? What give me something to hang on to. And oftentimes we ask for really general feedback. So imagine at the end of this session, I say to the team, to the WiLD team, Claire, how was the session? It was good. Awesome. We move on. Versus Claire, you know, one of the things I'm really trying to work on, because I get so excited about this content and the research, I'm really working on modulating my tone, speaking low and going slow. How did that work in this last session? And then she can give me actually some specific feedback on how that went. And so I find oftentimes, and I'm guilty of this, like I said, we give lazy requests for feedback, and then we get pretty vague, obtuse, non-actionable responses. So ask for often, get as specific as you can, but also ask the right people. So I ask for often. I'm not just saying go ask everybody all the time for feedback everywhere. That's only going to increase the noise. Asking for feedback regularly gives people permission, but also who are the right people? There's an ancient proverb that says, an enemy multiplies kisses, but that wounds from a friend can be trusted. And years ago, I had a close friend who was giving me some corrective feedback. And he said, just so you know, he was really big into World War I and World War II history. He said, if you and I were ever soldiers and went to battle together, I would trip you up, even if it hurt, if it meant saving your life. And so I'm going, okay, so what feedback do you have for me? But it was his way of saying, I'm going to bring this to you because you trust me and I care about you. So it's important for us as leaders to consider who are the people we're going to? Who are the people who are actually going to give it to us tough, but in a tender way with plenty of love, not overemphasizing one and the other. They're going to bring us the truth, but they're also going to be connected to us at the same time. Because if there's something I've seen is that, again, we get so many complaints as leaders. The question is, how do I know what feedback I can trust? So who are the handful of people you trust enough to be able to give you that direct feedback? Or maybe they don't see you directly in your life and work, but when you get corrective feedback, you can bring it to them and say, can you help me process this and help me understand how this holds up, where it fits and where it doesn't. I need someone to help me filter through and sift through this feedback. So who are the people who you know are going to bring it to you and don't have an ulterior motive in the feedback they're bringing? And fourth, reward people for giving you feedback. Feedback can be tough to receive, but it's also tough to deliver. So if someone's taken the time and taken your invitation and brought you the feedback, and they've given you that specificity, hopefully balancing honesty with kindness, how do you respond to them? Do you respond with gratitude? Thank you so much for sharing that. I wasn't aware of that, but now that you brought that to my attention, I see some specific things I can do. I'll keep you posted on how it goes. Or thanks for sharing that. I can tell it was difficult for you to deliver. Your effort meant a lot. I need to process that a little more. That's the first time I'm hearing this. I'm going to do some thinking and I'm going to follow up with you, let you know if I have any questions. Receiving feedback doesn't mean you have to act on all of it, but being able to acknowledge and affirm, thank you for taking the time to bring me feedback, continues to open up that door so that you can actually get the honest feedback from those who might have something valuable to bring, but depending on your role to them in the organization, they might not do that. And so asking for often, getting specific, asking the right people, and rewarding people for that feedback. So one of the reasons with leaders, we often use a tool called the Strategic Network Audit and Guide as part of the WiLD Toolkit. And one of the things that I love about that tool, it looks at a variety of roles. Who are the people who are advocating for you and sponsoring you? Who are those who are mentoring you and advising you? Who's the safe harbor who gives you emotional support? And one of them is feedback. And having a handful of people who you can go to regularly for specific feedback is a powerful thing. And if you can continue to give them reward them by thanking them, it keeps that faucet open for you. So if you're starting to get better feedback, the question then becomes, okay, so what do I actually do? Do I just take every bit of feedback? If I took everything from every 360, every survey my organization did, every bit of customer feedback, I'd be overwhelmed. How do I know what to boil it down to and crystallize? So as far as I can tell, and this is what the research suggests too, there's three big responses you can take. When you get feedback, you can either change your behavior aligned with that feedback, which is another way of saying increase your performance. You can double down. You can receive feedback and say, okay, um, I think I need to change the standard. So instead of trying to jump over the bar, I might need to lower the bar. Basically, instead of increasing my performance, I'm going to lower my performance. Or you just say, yeah, I'm going to reject that feedback. I don't think that holds true. I'm going to choose to ignore that. So those are three responses. Here's a couple ways I think can help us. If you get feedback, if to discern, should I act on it? One, is it an issue that has a true meaningful impact on you and others? Is the issue that's being brought up, does it have a meaningful impact on you, your performance, your whole life, or other people? Is it something that has importance? And are there specific things you can identify to increase that performance? Is it so general that you don't know what to do? Or is there something you see, okay, I can take action on this? And is it thematic? Have you heard this input from multiple sources, maybe over time? I had a performance review about 10 years ago with a supervisor, and my boss gave me she gave me the exact same feedback that my wife had just given me 3 days before. Different context. Turns out I was a common denominator. So there was a place to say, all right, Daniel, step it up, press on the gas, double your performance, get on it. But sometimes the feedback reveals a place that maybe we're trying to jump too high. We need to lower the bar. So for example, maybe you look and you say, all right, I've been getting this feedback again and again, and I think the performance standard is unrealistically high. As a leader, you might have more autonomy than you think to be able to change the standards. Sometimes our measures of success are self-imposed and not a true indication of success. So in my work with Dr. McKenna, there's certain places that he sets goals as a team, and there's certain places I have self-imposed goals. And sometimes I might need to stop and say, okay, why am I holding myself to this standard? And maybe I invite others in to help me recalibrate what would be the right target. Or maybe it's a goal that somebody else set for you and you're just not going to achieve it. And so you continue to get feedback that you're not meeting the bar, because the bar, it's not about you. The next person in the role is going to have the same challenge. And so then there's an opportunity to start negotiating what the standard looks like. And so you might either change it because it's self-imposed or negotiate with other people and make it something that is still challenging, so you can actually push yourself, but something you can actually achieve. And lastly, how do you know if you reject the feedback? Couple things that might be helpful. One, is the feedback source credible? Is the feedback source credible? That's why finding a handful of people to give you feedback, hopefully who come from a diverse set of perspectives, so you're not just getting an echo chamber, having a diverse set of people who are credible and can actually have insight into the situation. Sometimes you get feedback and you go, I don't think this person actually understands the context or actually understands the situation. And so you might ignore that feedback. Or maybe you got some negative feedback, but you've had overwhelmingly positive contradictory feedback from other people who bring diverse perspectives. You say, I think this is a one-off. This might have to do more with the individual than it has to do with me. Or maybe the issue is really minor. It's just not worth spending time on. You look at it and you go, you know what? I have other people on my team with that strength and they're doing that. And so I don't need to worry about that for me right now. It's not something that's getting in the way of performance. It's not an ethical issue. It's not a moral issue. Or maybe the issue is something you actually do not have influence on. So often we see leaders spin their tires focusing on factors that are beyond their control. Sometimes the opposite is true and you actually have more agency than you think. But what are the things that you can actually do and change? For example, back in higher ed, you often hear complaints about the cost of tuition. which is a problem. It's a systemic problem, but it's not a problem that you might be in a position to fix if you're a mid-level leader or a dean. You might be able to influence it, speak into that, come up with some creative solutions. But at the end of the day, it's not something you can actually change. And so you might choose to reject that feedback and focus on the things that you actually have the ability to impact, influence, that are going to make a meaningful difference for you and other people. At the end of the day, though, no matter what you do to increase the flow of feedback or what you do to discern what you should pay attention to, what's feedback, what's noise, it starts with you, it starts with me as a leader. And that's why today, what I did not want to focus on is how do you give feedback? How do you give really good feedback? You could take some of those tips and flip them around, but I think it starts with us to say, how do I start to discern for myself? And how do I start to receive and internalize and metabolize feedback? And by doing that, as we practice that muscle embedded into our own rhythms, it starts to give permission to those we lead that they can do that too. Because creating a culture of feedback or a place where we can be honest with each other is a lot less about just teaching people the three simple steps to giving feedback, but it's a lot more about getting into the nuances of how do we discern, what do we pay attention to, what do we let go of, and how do we have that honest conversation, first with ourselves and then inviting others into that process as well. So I'm excited to hear where this conversation goes. I know there's so many places that your breakouts will lead you into based on this, and a whole series of conversations we could have just on feedback. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rob and get us into our breakout.